All right. Looks like we are in business. Right? Yes. Streaming's working, Mishnah's up, router, we'll find out. All right, so first thing we have to do is finish up chapter 10, and then we will be on to chapter 11. I should warn you that if there aren't a lot of questions, that if there aren't questions, there is a chance we might finish Chullin tonight, because the last two chapters are relatively short, but we'll see. So let's go ahead and finish up chapter 10 and see where we go from there. So we are on chapter 10, Mishnah number 4. A convert who converted and owned a cow. If he slaughtered it before he converted, he is exempt from giving gifts. If he slaughtered it after he converted, he is liable. If there was a doubt about it, he is exempt, for the burden of proof lies upon the claimant. All right, so we are continuing from where we were 2 weeks ago, where we are talking about the gifts from the portions of a slaughtered animal that are dedicated to the Kohanim, to the priests. And the question before us here as we finish up this topic is, well, what about somebody who converted? After all, they have a cow, the cow has been slaughtered, doesn't the Kohen have a share? And the answer is, it depends. If he slaughtered it before he converted, then since at the time of its slaughter he was not yet Jewish, therefore he would not owe anything of that slaughtered meat to a Kohen, even if he hasn't finished butchering it until after he has finished the conversion. On the other hand, if he slaughters it after he converted, then obviously he is a Jew in every way, and therefore he would be responsible for those portions to go to the Kohen. The interesting line is the next part. If there was a doubt, meaning for whatever reason it wasn't clear when it was slaughtered, for example, if he wasn't doing the slaughtering, but it was slaughtered on his behalf, and the shochet, the butcher, did not know if he finished the slaughter before he went to the mikvah, meaning the convert, or after he went to the mikvah, so there is some fuzziness on the exact timeline of slaughter and mikvah, it is the Kohen who has to bring proof that the slaughtering happened after the mikvah. It is not up to the convert to prove that the slaughtering took place before his dip. It is up to the Kohen. And that is because, as a general rule, not 100%, but really general rule, the person who comes with the claim, meaning gimme, is the person who has to bring proof. I don't have to prove that I don't owe you anything. You have to prove that I owe you something. That is a general rule of thumb for any of our give and take, any of our business transactions that happen in Judaism. If you're making a demand from me, you've got to prove it. The neutral sort of default position is what I own is mine. If you want to claim that it belongs to you, you have to show up with some evidence before that will be accepted. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, he's proving that it belongs to the Kohen, not that it belongs to him, right? Because if the Kohen prevails, then he can give it to whoever he wants, right?
The Kohen is the one who needs to bring proof that it belongs to the Kohen.
Right. And if the Kohen proves his case, he doesn't have to give it to that Kohen, right?
I think you're using the word Kohen twice there in that sentence.
Right.
If the Kohen proves his case, that indeed the slaughter took place after the mikvah, then the convert has to give those portions to the Kohen. What the Kohen does with it then is up to the Kohen.
But there's more than one Kohen, right? So he can pick which Kohen to give it to, or no?
No. It's the one that requests is the one that is served.
Oh.
Yeah, first come, first serve in many of these situations. But now I understand what you mean by the alternative. All right, and now in typical Mishnaic fashion, let's define something that we've been talking about now for a couple of Mishnahs, which we haven't actually told you what it is. What is the shoulder? This is one of the portions that's set aside for the Kohen, and up to this point, we don't have a clear definition. And, I can just imagine if I were to ask you, what is the shoulder on a cow? Your definition of a shoulder might be different than my definition of a shoulder. And in particular, if you're the person whose cow it is, you probably want a narrow definition of shoulder. And if you are a Kohen, you probably want a very big definition of a shoulder, because that means you'll get more meat. So it's very important that we actually define what a shoulder is, rather than just having a wrestling match over how much of the leg belongs to the Kohen. And the answer is from the joint up to the shoulder socket of the forelimb. And this is the same for the Nazirite. The Nazirite also has to do a shoulder, and this is the same definition for that. But just to clarify again, what the Mishnah is talking about as the joint is the ankle. So everything from the ankle all the way up until where it meets where it disappears into the socket in the torso of the animal, that is all the shoulder. So basically, what we would consider the whole leg. It's not only the topmost part, but really the entirety of that is considered to be the shoulder. And as it is a shoulder, meaning singular, just as a little FYI, it is understood to be only the right shoulder of the animal, not both of them. Part 3, the corresponding part of the hind leg, meaning the leg at the back of the animal, is called the thigh. Rabbi Judah says the thigh extends from the joint up to the fleshy part of the leg. Right? He does not say that it goes further up, but it disappears around the knee. Rabbi Judah is voted out. He does not win this debate, and so it is instead the entire leg. And then as far as the cheek goes, what counts as the cheek? From the joint of the jaw to the last protrusion of the windpipe. So from where the jaw meets, like, up here in the skull, the jaw pivot point in the head, down to the first joint of the windpipe where we get those ridges, everything in between, that is considered to be the cheek of the animal, and that also belongs to the Kohen. Questions or comments? Okay. So now we have to talk about some wool. Why? Because in Deuteronomy 8, there is also a mitzvah of giving the Kohen the first wool that has been shorn from the sheep. And as Rabbi Kolb does, let's just go ahead and look at that verse in short order. You shall also give him, the priest, the first fruits of your new grain and wine and oil, and the first shearing of your sheep. So we give him the cheek, the shoulder, the stomach. We also give him the first fruits of the grain, the wine and oil, and the shearing of the sheep, meaning wool. And that's what we're going to be talking about now. Yes, Natan?
But the first one is after 3 years, like the trees, like only at the third year, or also in the first year?
No, this is when you shear, whenever you are shearing your sheep, this is that you have to give. We don't, you don't have, if you don't shear the sheep, then you don't have to give anything. But if you are shearing, then you do have to give.
So, but you, what's the verb? Shear, you shear the sheep,
right?
Shear every summer. But so you give, but you don't need to wait, like, for example, to cut the human hair or the first trees in the first fruit of the tree 3 years. You don't need to wait 3 years for the sheep.
No, you do not. And I should also point out, you don't need to wait for cutting human hair either. The idea of cutting human hair at like 3 or 4 is a very recent custom in Eastern European. It's only a few hundred years old.
Okay, thank you.
That is not in the Mishnah, Talmud, or any of the medieval texts. It's relatively new. And it's a perfectly fine custom, but it is just a custom. As opposed to Orla, where we don't eat from the fruit of the tree for the first 3 years. Yes, Aaron?
So, Rabbi, they got to give the first of the fleece every year, or is it just when they get a new flock? It would be every year?
It'd be every year. Whenever you do the shear, this is all part of the annual support, financial support for the Kohanim.
But then how many fleeces do a sheep do a year?
Okay, so why don't we wait and look at the chapter and see what we're giving? So let's go ahead and talk about, let's look at the Mishnah before we talk about it's because it's not like a whole fleece. You're not like necessarily giving them the entirety of every animal. So let's just like you're not giving the entirety of your grain, oil, or other things. So part 2 from this breakdown of the Mishnah. The law of the first of the fleece is in force both within the land and outside of it, both during the existence of the temple and after it, in respect of unconsecrated animals, but not in respect to consecrated animals. So we would still be keeping this mitzvah today if you are a shepherd. And this works with or without a temple, because it's not contingent on that. But if an animal has been sanctified, dedicated to the temple, then you don't have to give the first shearing to the Kohen. Of course, it would still belong to the temple in general. So that's still in effect. And that is, as Culp points out, similar to the shoulder and cheek. However, there is a difference. The law of the shoulder and the cheeks and of the stomach, which we looked in the last chapter, is of stricter application than the law of the first of the fleece. For the law of the shoulder and the cheek and the stomach applies both to herds and flocks, meaning cattle as well as sheep, whether they are many or few, right? Whether you have a huge number of cows or whether you have a few, you're still giving from each one that you slaughter the same portions to the Kohen. Whereas the law of the first of the the laws of the first of the fleece applies only to sheep and only when there are many. So we're going to talk about many in Mishnah 2, but the first shearing only counts for sheep. So if you are a llama farmer and you shear your llamas, that does not need to go to the Kohen. And all the more so if you are a cattle rancher and you are taking off the leather, that doesn't belong to the Kohen for this mitzvah either. So only for sheep and only for many. The many will be for tomorrow. Okay, Natan, I see your hand.
Yeah, but only for the first time in the life of sheep, not every year.
No, every year.
But you share the sheep only once a year.
Right,
before the
but you
summer.
don't. Right, but this is the first of your shearing, not all of your first shearing.
What? Sorry.
So for example, when we give the first of our olive oil, that doesn't mean that we're going to take all of our olives from this time, crush them, and give them all of that oil and keep none of it for ourselves. But from first crushing,
First sheep.
right? So from the first action, the first shearing, we have to give to the Kohen.
Oh, that was a problem of English here. Okay, perfect. Now it's clear. Thank you.
Well, yes, I know it's absolutely, there are always language questions. Aaron, you have your hand too?
Yeah. So Rabbi, my understanding is if you have 5 or more sheep, then you have to give them at least enough wool to make a shash.
Okay, so we haven't gotten there yet. So that's Mishnah 2. And let's read it first before we analyze it. Okay, so Mishnah 2, like Rabbi Kulp said, we finished last week. Sorry, I say last week because that was our last discussion, but it wasn't anyway. We said in the section that we just read that it only matters if there are many sheep, but we didn't define that. Now we are going to. So how much is many? Beit Shammai says at least 2 sheep. As it is said in Isaiah 7, a man shall rear a young cow and 2 sheep. That sounds like a definition of what a reasonable amount of sheep are. That sounds like a flock, right? Since it does say tson, the word for flock in Deuteronomy, therefore that must be it. And it also fits because it's plural. However, Beit Hillel says, no, it needs to be 5. That the verse in 1 Samuel 28 talks about 5 sheep, and that is what it means to have a flock. 2 sheep are 2 sheep. 5 sheep, now you've got a flock. That is our minimum for a flock, according to Beit Hillel, who does win this particular argument. So our definition is 5 sheep. So if you only have 4 sheep on your farm and you are cutting off their wool, you can keep all of that wool. But 5 sheep, now we need to start counting. And that's what we're going to talk about in in section 3. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkanas says 5 sheep, right, which each produce a fleece which weighs a mana and a half, are subject to the laws of the first fleece. But the sages say 5 sheep, whatever their fleeces weigh. So Rabbi Dosa is trying to say that there needs to be a minimum amount of wool, right? You can't, like if I have 5 sheep, but all of them have incredibly short hair, then I shouldn't have to give anything to the Kohen, because that's not really a flock's worth of wool. But the sages say 5 sheep are 5 sheep. That's what is the minimum, because the Torah says a flock. It doesn't say an amount, it says a flock. And we've decided that 5 is the flock. So whether they have lots of wool, whether they have little wool, that is what we are going to be taking from. But now, how much are we actually giving? Well, this is in part 4. And how much should one give him? Right? Because we don't have to give all of it. This is going back to the confusion we had about the shearing. The weight of 5 selas in Judah, which is equal to 10 selas in Galilee. Now, they had slightly different weights and measures between the section of Israel known as Judah, that's the middle part of Israel, and the Galilee, which is the northern part of Israel. And so this is like trying to convert between kilograms and pounds, even though they use the same term. Yes, it's confusing. That's why they use the 2 different versions here. Bleached wool and not dirty wool, sufficient to make from it a small garment, for it is written, give him, meaning when there is enough to be considered a gift. So you have to give approximately 5 selas, or 10 if you're in the north, in order for it to be considered a gift, and that would be enough to make a small garment. Now, the example that the Talmud uses is like a sash, like a scarf. That would be how much wool you need to give. And the wool you give has to be fine wool, meaning not the dirty wool, but it also doesn't have to be the bleached wool. You don't have to have, you do have to have made it bleached wool. You have to have made it clean for the Kohen so that he can use it directly. And then we get to part 5. If the owner did not manage to give the fleece to the priest until he had dyed it, he is exempt. If he bleached it, but he did not dye it, he is still liable. So if you've already dyed it before you had the chance to give it to the priest, technically you are off the hook, meaning you have not violated the commandment, but you have failed to fulfill the commandment. And this is something that I think we'll talk about more when we talk about shooing the mother bird away. But in general, there are the 2 different types of commandments, things that we must do and things that we must not do. The giving of the fleece to the Kohen is something we must do. And if you have dyed it, then technically it's no longer givable in order to fulfill the mitzvah of giving the first fleece to the Kohen. And so you have missed out on that opportunity. And we'll talk about this, like I said, more with the mother bird. However, if you have bleached it, but you didn't dye it, meaning that you haven't given it, but it is bleached and it's in that prepared category, it is okay, then you still have to give it to the Kohen and fulfill that mitzvah. Yes, sir.
How come it's exempt if it's dyed? Is it because it's been increased to a state that someone would want to keep it?
No, technically it's because by transforming it through the dye process, you have exerted ownership over it, and therefore it is and remains your property. Now, you of course can still give it in quotes to the priest, but that giving does not count as fulfilling the mitzvah.
But how can you acquire ownership? I thought it was designated for the priest from the time it comes off the wool. How do you acquire ownership over it at that point?
So through the transformation of the product, by moving it from being a natural product to being a worked product, it becomes essentially a different product. Now, all of this is discussed more in the Talmud, of course, and that's why the Talmud is written, because of questions like that, which require much more discussion in order to clear up all of the different possibilities. And there's a few more possibilities that we need to work out. If a man bought the fleeces of a flock belonging to a non-Jew, he is exempt from the law of the first of the fleece. Right? It is from your flock that you must give. It doesn't matter if you buy from someone else, because then it's not your flock. You're just buying wool. So even if you bought the bare fleece, meaning the main shearing part, still, it is only if it comes from your flock that it becomes necessary to give the gift.
And if you are renting the sheep?
If you are, oh, you mean if you like rent the sheep from a non-Jew?
Yeah, it's yours. The sheep is yours. But it's not yours. It's temporarily yours, but you don't have the ownership of the sheep. So in this case, what do you do?
It's a good question. Let me think real quick. So I just want to make sure we got the same situation. So you have rented the sheep from your non-Jewish neighbor. You've rented the flock. And as part of the rental, you will be allowed to shear the sheep and keep the wool for yourself. That's what you're renting them for. Yeah. So, you know, I'd have to double check. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say that technically then, since you own the wool of the flock, that would be still liable for the mitzvah. You would have to give to the Kohen that minimum amount. But you can't quote me on that, because I'm just going off the basic logic of usually what happens when you rent something. You know, if I rent a field and I plant wheat, I'm responsible for the tithing of that wheat. So usually in those situations, rental means that you are responsible for fulfilling the mitzvahs with that item. But that's by logic. That's not because I've read it. So don't quote me on that.
Okay, makes sense for me. Thank you.
If a man bought the fleeces of a flock belonging to his neighbor, meaning a Jewish person, if the seller kept some back, the seller is liable. But if he did not withhold anything, the buyer is liable. So if I buy from another Jew, I know that there is a mitzvah for giving the fleece to the Kohen. If the owner has only sold me some of these fleeces, then it's his responsibility to use what's ever left to fulfill the mitzvah. But if I know that he sold me all of them, like we talked about sort of buying in advance all of the wool, then I'm the one responsible for that, because the mitzvah is attached to the wool of the Jews, and thus it needs to be fulfilled by me, the buyer, or by the original owner of the sheep. And then in part 8, if he had two kinds of wool, gray and white, and he sold the gray but not the white, or if he sold the wool of the males but not of the females, he must give the first, each must give the first of the fleece for himself. So continuing on with the idea of having a seller, and the seller sold half of what he had, or not necessarily half, but one type of what he had, and kept one type for himself, then both the seller and the buyer have to give of the fleece. Because they are of two different types, they count as two different shearings, I guess you would say. And that means that we can't say the seller kept back part of it, right? He sold the gray, all of it, and he didn't sell the white. He has to give from the white, and the buyer would have to give from the gray, because they don't act as though they were combined. They act as two separate flocks, basically, as two separate groups.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how do they proportion out who has to give? So if he hasn't given any yet and sells it, they just deduct it from the selling price when he sells the fleece?
Well, that's up to if he has. So which he? I'm sorry, the pronouns are a little confusing.
Strike that. If the seller hasn't, one of them has to give the full six. What is the 6 selas?
Right.
Yeah, one of them has to give the full 6 selas. So if the 6 selas hasn't been given yet, then the other person has to give the 6 selas, even if he only bought 3 selas.
So if there wasn't enough to actually fulfill the mitzvah, meaning they didn't actually have enough fleece, then you don't have enough. What I think you're trying to say is, if I have the wool and I sell it to someone, and the buyer buys all of it, then the buyer is responsible for delivering the portion to the Kohen. If the buyer doesn't buy all of it, then the seller, me, is responsible for that. The question I think you're getting at is, well, how do you fix the price for that? Do you deduct the price from the buyer for the amount that's needed to go to the Kohen, because you know the buyer himself is not actually going to keep it? And just like we saw before, if it is a known quantity that is a known mitzvah that has to be fulfilled, then that does not get automatically deducted. It's because everybody knows that if you're buying all the fleece, that the Kohen gets their share. So it would need to be explicit if you wanted to make any changes to that. If you were going to say to him, look, I'm going to buy the fleece, but I'm not paying for the fleece that has to go to the Kohen, at that point, it's needs to be made into part of the contract.
Right, I get that. What I meant, let's put it this one. Let's say the buyer has 14 selas of wool and sells me 6 selas of wool, and none of it has been given to the Kohen. Who has to give the fleece to the Kohen at that point?
The seller. If the seller did not sell all of it, then the seller is responsible first and foremost.
And let's say the seller sold 9 of those 14 selas, then who would be having to give? Then it would be the buyer?
That would be an interesting question. So if he sold enough that he does not have enough to meet the minimum, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
In a situation like that, it's a good question. The Kohen definitely deserves to get his due, and clearly there was enough to give him his due. I don't know off the top of my head how that would need to be adjudicated. Obviously, the short answer is to say, don't make a deal like that, and instead work out in advance who's going to take the extra for the Kohen. But I don't know if it wasn't worked out who the Kohen would have a claim against. That's a good head scratcher. All right. And now we turn to the bird. Chapter 12, we are going to deal with the question of what's called shiluach haken, the sending away of a bird. And again, let's do it with the verse, because the different elements of it will be, I think, important. This is from Deuteronomy 22. If along the road you chance upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground, with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings, that term sitting is actually going to become very important. It's not the usual phrase for sitting, as we'll see. Sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let the mother go. Literally send the mother away. Take only the young in order that you may fare well and have a long life. So this final chapter of Chullin is going to deal with that shooing away of the mother. So the law of letting the mother bird go from the nest is in force both within the Holy Land, meaning Israel, and outside of it, here in the diaspora, both during the existence of the temple and after it, meaning this is still right now a relevant mitzvah in respect of unconsecrated birds, but not consecrated birds. That should be a familiar exemption, that if it's been a bird that's been dedicated to the temple, then the whole the whole package belongs to the temple, and you don't need to shoo the bird away. But anything else, then yes, it needs to be dealt with. All right, and we're going to do another comparison before we get down to some details. The law of covering up the blood, which we talked about a long time ago, it feels now, is of broader application than the law of letting the mother bird go. For the law of covering up the blood applies to wild animals as well as birds, whether they are at one's disposal or not. Let's just do that disposal part. All right, wild animals and birds, hopefully that's very clear, but one's disposal. At one's disposal, as we're going to see, is referring to whether or not the animal is within your domain, within your actual house. So if you've ever wondered, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, do I have to shoo away the chicken before I take its eggs from the back of the chicken coop when I'm collecting the eggs each day? The answer is no, as we're going to see in more detail. That chicken does not fall under this rule. And that is because, I'm just going to scroll back up, that is because of that wonderful little phrase, chance upon, right? If along the road you chance upon. These are not your domesticated birds. These are random birds that you are coming across by luck when you are out. Your domesticated birds, you do not do this particular mitzvah with. Otherwise, you'd be doing it constantly, and it wouldn't be a rather exceptional mitzvah, would it? And one other distinction from whereas the law of letting the mother bird go from the nest applies only to birds and only to those which are not at one's disposal. So that means that, like I said, we only shoo away the mother bird. We don't shoo away wild animals from their young, and we only shoo away the mother bird if it is one of these random birds, not one of our birds in our property. Yes, Natan.
Need to be a kosher bird, or could be also unkosher?
So we are going to be doing unkosher birds in just a minute in the next Mishnah. So hold on to that that thought. But let's finish up Mishnah 1. Which are they that are not at one's disposal, right? That seems like a bit of a question. Does that mean just if they're not my property? Or does that mean just if they're not domesticated, but even if they're on my property? Or does it mean even domesticated, but not on my property? What does that mean? So, such as geese and fowls that made their nests in the open field, but if they made their nests within a house or in a case of Herodian doves, one is not bound to let the mother bird go. So that means that a geese or other type of bird that's just out in the field, that is not at your disposal. That is not your bird, and therefore you have to shoo away. Even if you own that goose or own those birds, if they make their nests just out in the wild, meaning like beyond your little chicken coop or dovecote, then that has to be shooed away when you take the young. But if it is in a house, or if it's in like the little nesting cubicles, that's a good English word. Dovecote is the English word, but no one knows what that is. Little nest cubicles. Then those you do not have to shoo when you are taking from the eggs underneath it. And in fact, you could take them together. And by the way, if you've never seen the Herodian cubicles for birds, this is something that you can see in some of the archaeological sites. It looks like a giant row of mailboxes, little cubbies that all the birds would nest in. All right, and now Mishnah 2. And Mishnah 2 is where we're going to talk about the non-kosher birds. An unclean, in this case, not kosher bird, one is not obligated to let it go. Of course, you still can't eat it, and you can't eat its eggs either. But if you were collecting them as a trapper, and you were going to sell them to a non-Jewish person, or you were collecting their feathers or some other usage of them, you would not be required for this mitzvah. It's only for actually kosher birds that you are required to perform this mitzvah. Part 2 gets us a little wrinkle. If an unclean bird was sitting on the eggs of a clean bird, or a clean bird on the eggs of an unclean bird, one is not obligated to let it go. So if there is a mix-up, which can absolutely happen, as we'll see in part 3, where let's say an eagle was sitting on a dove's eggs, you do not have to shoo the eagle away, although you're probably going to want to, before you take those eggs. And vice versa, if you have a chicken sitting on eagle eggs, you are not obligated to shoo, because it is the relationship of the mother to the eggs that is significant here. And if the eggs don't belong to that bird because it's the wrong bird on it, then it doesn't count. And thus the mitzvah doesn't kick into force. And that's going to help us understand part 3 as well. As to a male partridge, Rabbi Eliezer obligates one to let it go, but the sages exempt. Right? The male partridge will sometimes sit on the eggs. And the question is, it is their eggs, but they didn't lay those eggs. So does that count as being the mother, and thus I need to shoo it away? Or because it is a male, does it not count? And the end result is that it is very precise. It's it's only the mother that triggers this mitzvah. And because it's the male partridge, it does not trigger the mitzvah. And thus you do not have the obligation of shooing away the male partridge before taking from the nest. Yes, Natan.
A question, if I remember, if I understood correctly, if you are in a place that where the majority of the birds are kosher, okay, and you have one falcon or whatever that's not kosher, okay, and there is an egg, do you need to what is the verb? Shoo everyone else, because the majority, one of the majority could be the mom or not, because it's mixed.
So you mean you like come across a field and there's a bunch of nests, and the majority of the birds that are on those nests are all kosher birds, and
Correct.
there's one non-kosher bird sitting on a nest, and
Correct.
you think the non-kosher bird is sitting on the nest of a kosher bird.
Correct.
So you would have to shoo all of the kosher birds away, and you don't have to shoo the non-kosher bird, but you would have to check to see if the eggs underneath it were from a kosher animal or not. Sometimes you can tell that if you are familiar with the eggs of different birds, which people living in the ancient world would have been much more so than most moderns.
Okay.
So yeah,
so,
if
so
a non-kosher bird,
you
go ahead.
no, that still you go by the rule of the majority. In the way that you behave, the majority of the bird is It's what makes your behavior, if you shoot them or not.
Well, not exactly, because I mean, if there were 5 falcons sitting on nests and there were 2 doves sitting on nests, I would still treat the falcon as not needing to be shooed away, that the mitzvah doesn't apply to the falcon, regardless of what it sits on. But I would still have to shoe the dove. Now, if I shoe the dove and I see that it's sitting on a non-kosher egg, then yes, I can now treat it differently. But until I look under it, chances are I won't be able to tell.
So still you need to shoot the kosher bird no matter what.
As long as you don't know what eggs are under it, you would assume that the eggs are going to be kosher. But if you know the eggs aren't kosher, which is what we're going to see a little bit in a glimpse in the next Mishnah, then you would have a different option. Yes, Aaron.
This one was confusing to me though, because if a kosher bird is sitting on non-kosher eggs or vice versa, that means they are of different species for the most part, right? And if there are different species, this doesn't apply.
Right. So I think there's like, we don't apply if they're different species, because not just because they're not kosher. I mean, we don't apply the kosher versus non-kosher because they are completely different categories. But we're also not going to get into detailed ornithology. Second time today I've had to say that. We're not going to get into detailed bird like biology to be able to know precisely whether this egg came from this bird, meaning this actual mother, or whether this egg came from a different one, or maybe even from another kosher species. But for whatever reason, that kosher species is sitting on this particular one. That may be hard to identify, especially before we pick up the bird. And that's going to lead us into Mishnah 3, which is how sitting does the bird need to be? And well, let's read. If the mother was hovering over the nest, right? If you've ever seen an agitated bird that's like hopping up and down with the wings flapping as you're reaching for the eggs, if her wings touch the nest, one is obligated to let her go. If her wings do not touch the nest, one is not obligated to let her go. So this is answering the question of what happens if I come along a nest and there are eggs sitting there and I can identify them as kosher eggs and the mother's not around, or the mother's like on another branch. How do I shoo her away if she's not there? And the answer is you don't have to. You can go ahead and take the eggs with no problem, and you don't need to do any obligatory sending away. On the other hand, if she is hovering above the nest right there, and her wings are coming down and touching the nest on her flapping, then even though she's not sitting, we would still send her away. That still triggers the mitzvah requirement. And so this is where we talked about before, if you're looking and you can see that underneath her are the eggs that are clearly from a different species, like a falcon or eagle, then you would say, you're on eagle eggs, fine. I can just grab the mother and she is now yours to slaughter as appropriate. So if you can see that she's, not sitting on these proper eggs, then the mother can be taken and doesn't need to be sent away. And that is going to be part of what we continue with, of when do we need to send her and not under these unusual circumstances. If there was but one young bird or one egg in the nest, one is still obligated to let the mother go, for it is written a nest, implying any nest whatsoever. So although our text back in Deuteronomy uses a plural for eggs or fledglings, the baby birds, that is not a requirement because the same verse also says a nest. Therefore, if she is on a nest, and that means there is an egg or a fledgling, then she is needs to be sent away. you don't need a plural of eggs or a plural of young. On the other hand, if there were young birds able to fly or spoiled eggs, one is not obligated to let the mother go. For it is written, and the mother sitting upon the young or upon the eggs. Just as the young are living beings, so the eggs must be such as would produce living beings. This excludes spoiled eggs. And just as the eggs need the care of the mother, so the young must be such as need the care of the mother. This excludes those that are able to fly. So in these are the beautiful poetry of the legal analysis that I really just always love and appreciate whenever I read the rabbis doing this type of analysis. They say, look, the Torah mentions the young in a particular way and the eggs. And the young can help us understand what we mean by egg, and egg can help us understand what we mean by young. The young helps us understand egg. The young are alive. The eggs have to be alive. And the eggs help us understand the young. The eggs need care. The young need care. Once the young are old enough to fly, the mother is fair game. Once the eggs are ruined, the mother is fair game. It's just so elegant and beautifully put together as a way of seeing how the Torah is helping us understand both of them by using elements of each. Sorry, it's the parts like that it's just other people enjoy symphonies and other people enjoy, beautiful poetry or beautiful art. For me, the beautiful elegance of the rabbinic analysis is something that always gives me a thrill. Okay, part 4. If one let the mother go and she returned, even 4 or 5 times, he is still obligated to let her go again. For it is written, you shall surely let the mother go. This is the grammatical form that's used in the Torah as a doubling up of the infinitive, which is often used for interpretation. And in this case, the interpretation is, you really have to keep sending her away. Even if she gets sent away and comes back, sent away and comes back, sent away and comes back, you don't say, hey, I sent her away once, now she's fair game. No, you have to keep doing it over and over. And then in 5, part 5, if one said, I will take the mother and let the young go, he is still obligated to let her go. For it is written, you shall surely let the mother go. So we say, send the mother and take the young. And you might think, therefore, well, what if I don't want the young and I just take the mother? And the answer is no, that's not the way it goes. The mitzvah is to send the mother and take the young. And that is the way you need to do it. Even if you preferred the mother over the young or the eggs, the mitzvah is as the mitzvah is written. You will surely let the mother go. And part 6, if one took the young and brought them back again to the nest, and afterwards the mother returned to them, he is not obligated to let her go. So once the eggs become your possession by having been gathered, even if you replace them in the nest, the mother is not something you have to send away anymore. Because remember, way back when we started chapter 12, we talked about the happenstance, happening upon, if they were just there and at your disposal. Well, once they are yours, they are no longer chance eggs. They are no longer not at your disposal. Therefore, the obligation to send the mother is no longer in effect. All right, moving on to Mishnah number 4, and a little more tea. So I mentioned before this interesting flux about a positive and negative commandments. Let's go ahead and look at that in more detail. If one took the mother with the young, all right, you have broken the commandment. You were supposed to send her and you didn't send her. Now notice, that was a positive commandment. You will send her away, and you didn't send her away. So you have violated a positive commandment. Rabbi Judah says he has incurred 40 lashes and he need not let her go now. So Rabbi Judah's opinion is you broke the commandment, and therefore you are to be lashed for the breaking of this commandment. And that means that you are no longer obligated to take her. Right? He sees this as being the breaking of a negative commandment, and thus you get the normal flogging that goes along with it. But the sages say he must let her go, and he does not incur lashes. So the sages say no, that there is a way to fix this problem. The way to fix this problem, your failure to send the mother away, is to send her away. And if there is a way to fix the problem, then there doesn't need to be a flogging that goes along with it. Right? There is an option here. You failed to fulfill this positive commandment, but it is still in your power to fulfill it. And once you fulfill it, you are no longer liable for punishment. This tikkun, this remedy, is a very important concept in Judaism, that if you have committed a transgression, but there is a way to fix that transgression, then you are obligated to do so. We don't just punish you and ignore the damage that has been done, or in this case, punish and ignore the easy remedy to your failure to fulfill the positive commandment. That we have in mind always looking out for how can we fix this before we get to how must this be punished. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, back to that word tikkun. How come I only see it mentioned one time in the Mishnah and with Rabbi Hillel, and it doesn't get used again?
Well, because the term tikkun is used a lot more in the Talmud, and it's used in many other ways than just like I mentioned. But it's really more through the later rabbinic commentators that term of tikkun as a fixing, a remedying for a problem becomes more and more common. Later on, it takes on Kabbalistic tones. And then even later still, really at the beginning of the 20th century, it takes on a more social turn. Well, in some ways, it returns to an original social turn from how the rabbis of the Talmud use it. But yes, that term tikkun as being a general word, a generic word for a repair of a particular breach is not unusual in rabbinic commentary, even if it wasn't used extensively in the Mishnaic time, the Tanaim.
Was it only used once in the Mishnah?
I cannot say that I've done a word search. So I can't give you that quote. However, Safaria will. If you do a word search for tikkun and then you limit it to only Mishnah, it'll tell you how many times it appears. However, continuing that topic, this is the general rule. For the transgression of any negative commandment, which has a remedy by the subsequent fulfillment of a positive commandment, one does not incur lashes. Right? So he transgressed the negative of taking, and he failed to fulfill the sending. But since he can take legitimately if he sends, meaning he can undo the wrongness of the taking by doing the rightness of the sending, then should he actually send, he is now fine. And he does not get punished for the violation of the negative commandment of the taking, because now his taking is okay, because he has repaired it. He has done the remedy of sending the mother. All right. Let's go ahead and finish up with the end here with Mishnah 5. One may not take the mother with the young, even for the sake of purifying a mitzorah. Now, for a mitzorah, we need to have two birds, and you might have thought that for something as serious as mitzorah, we are going to allow a violation of this rule that will let them take the mother and the young just to facilitate this incredibly important remedy from the spiritual problem. But No, you may not. This commandment is a commandment, and how we cure a mitzvah, or rather how we do the purification of mitzvah, is a commandment, and we do not allow that commandment to override this commandment. The mother has to be sent, even if it means we have to delay the purification for the mitzvah. And then it finishes off with a beautiful flourish. If in respect of so light a commandment, which deals with that which is but worth an isar, right? This is trivial for most people. The sending of a mother and the taking of a bird. I mean, really, we're not talking about breaking the bank here. This is not $1 million decision. This is not life and death. This is not about something, or this is not something for which people have great passions of, like they might feel compelled to commit other crimes and sins. I mean, honestly, all Torah is asking us to do is sacrifice the value of the mother bird that we shoo away. Really, this is not asking much from us. And thus it is light in the sense that it is very easy to be able to fulfill. But despite it being such an easy mitzvah to fulfill, the Torah says, in order that you may fare well and have a long life, that there is this this promise of a fulfillment for a reward for doing something which is such an easy mitzvah to do if you live in an agricultural society. How much more must be the reward for the observance of the more difficult commandments in the Torah? Think about how easy it is to shoo the mother away, and yet God promises a good and long life. All the more so if we do other commandments, even if they don't explicitly say that they are rewarded with a good and long life, how much more so must they also be giving us a good and long life? Because clearly, if God is rewarding us from doing something simple, God will reward us for doing things that are hard. Now, this is a beautiful way, in my opinion, and I don't think the rabbis need my thumbs up, but as always, I'm happy to give it, to the editing of Chullin to finish on this note, to try and remind us that keeping kosher is, well, maybe not quite as easy as shooing a mother bird away, but really, by and large, not overly complicated and overly difficult. Yes, if you're buying only kosher meat, it will be more expensive, so buy a bit less. And if you are buying only kosher products, you will not have every product to choose from. So everything that you could want in the modern world in particular, there is going to be a kosher version of it. It is not hard to keep kosher. It is not necessarily even much more expensive as long as you are being, shall we say, modest in your demands of how much meat you're going to be eating, which for many other reasons is probably a good idea anyway. Instead, God has given us so much opportunity through keeping kosher, through following the laws of kashrut. And for something that is so easy, just watch what you buy, watch how you cook it, and watch what you're eating. It is amazing how enriching it is to our life, how much it gives to us an opportunity each time we open our mouth for this amazing spiritual activity to really settle in on us. And that I think really sums up kashrut in my opinion. It's something that people treat with outsized dread or fear, or act as though it has to become this obsessive, neurotic fixation, when really it is not that hard to live by, and it is incredibly rewarding. So please, if you don't already keep kosher and you'd like more information, check out my other videos on kashrut as part of the Pathways class, or contact me directly, and I'd be happy to give you more advice and more instruction. And with that, we will bid farewell to Chullin. And I will remind you that I'm always taking suggestions for the next Masechet if there's something else you'd like to learn. Otherwise, it'll be up to me. And I will let you know when we meet again next week to continue our journey through the Mishnah. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.